Hello, welcome to Rivendell. My name's Nathan. In this video, I'm going to be talking about the sociological factors involved in young people becoming a part of a punk rock community. And there's two main lenses I'm going to look at this through. The first one involves young people's socioeconomic status, which just means how much money and wealth does their family have. And the second has to do with social identity. I think a good way to wrap our heads around this is looking at an experiment that was done on monkeys concerning fairness. In this experiment, they had two monkeys in separate cages, but they could see each other. And they were supposed to do a task, which was a simple one, just taking a rock and handing it to an experimenter through a hole. And if they did that, they got rewarded. There was two types of rewards. One was a cucumber, which was okay, but not that tasty. And another was a grape, which is sweet and delicious.
So when the monkey sees the other monkey getting grapes and he's only getting cucumbers, he gets pretty pissed off and he throws the cucumber at the experimenter.
Nobody likes to be treated unfairly, not even monkeys. And people get upset when they're treated unfairly. And as young people grow up, they're constantly asked, what do you want to be when you grow up? What do you want to be when you grow up? And in America, we have this concept of the American dream. When you're young and in high school, a lot of times it's presented to you, what do you want to be when you grow up? As if life is just a set of choices and you're shopping and you can just basically pick up whatever identity you want and put it in your cap. From a sociological perspective, that's quite absurd. Students and young people's socioeconomic background, or how much wealth and status their family has a huge effect on the possibilities of identity for them. And that's very true in the punk rock. Growing up in the United States, we constantly get this message about you can do anything you want. You can accomplish anything you want. It's the American dream ethos that if you work hard enough and if you really focus yourself, then no matter what your socioeconomic background is, that you can get ahead. Now the question is, how true is that?
The research shows that punk rock youth have some different qualities in general than other social groups of young people. For example, they're more likely to be alienated or have unsupported families. They're more likely to have lower social economic status. They're more likely to have a higher appreciation and interest in art, music, and film. And they're less likely to believe in narratives like the American dream.
Distributive justice theory is concerned with how resources and costs that affect individuals and groups are fairly allocated.
Distributive justice is primarily concerned with who gets what, why they get it, and is it fair.
It assumes that individuals hold justice standards that they compare against social interactions and exchanges that they have in the real world, and that positive or negative emotions happen when they feel that these justice standards or their sense of fairness is being violated. Nobody likes being treated unfairly, and people get upset when they feel like they're being treated unfairly. If you're a poor kid or coming from a struggling family of some kind, and the messages you're getting at school and community is, what's wrong with you? You know, why don't you just do what I tell you and you'll be successful? It's the American dream, right? Well, a lot of young people see this and they may not be able to articulate it, but they know it's pretty much a bunch of crap. And through these lived experiences, these young people get what's called a sense of social injustice. Like, it's not fair. These kids down the road have much different resources, and it has nothing to do with choices that the kids made. So young people coming from lower socioeconomic status and that are getting these messages from school and the broader culture and media that you can be whatever you want, just pull yourself up by the bootstraps and believe in the American dream, yet in their lived experiences that is not the case, feel a diminished or lower sense of belonging in those traditional social circles, like at school or in sport. A song by a band called Off, I think, captures this perfectly.
Cocktail party.
thing that young people struggle with is this idea of like, who am I and how do I fit into this world? And in the social sciences, there's two main approaches to this. One's called social identity theory and one's called identity theory. Now, identity theory is more psychological, and it has to do with the roles that individuals have. So everybody has different roles. You can be in a family, but sometimes your role might be brother or mom or uncle or grandson. And those roles change over time. In social identity theory, on the other hand, that looks at the groups that people are associated with and how those inform their identity. And we're all involved in any number of categorical groups. They could have to do with your race, your religion, your socioeconomic status, your nationality. I'm going to look more at social identity theory, or the groups that people are associated with and how they inform someone's sense of identity. And if young people, if the groups they're associated with at home or at school or church or wherever are unsatisfying or even abusive or neglectful, they're going to seek out a sense of belonging somewhere else. And I think this is a big component that drives a lot of kids towards the punk rock community. And no matter what social groups that young people are involved with, we all want to feel good about who we are, whether we're a gang member or whether we're a senator's son. So we all ascribe positive meanings to the groups that we associate with. No matter what the dominant culture says about them, we want to feel good about who we are. So we attribute positive meanings to the groups that we associate with. So in gangs, which is one of the most villainized groups on the media, what are the positive aspects of a gang identity? Well, there's got to be loyalty, there's community, there's a sense of protection, and there's also this masculinity of toughness, which is so pervasive in our society about what it means to be a man. I came across some research that was done in 1986 about the different topics and subjects that punk rock music addresses versus the topics and subjects that pop music on the radio addresses. So I think it's interesting to take a look at these charts. First, let's take a look at the topics and subjects that pop music on the radio was addressing.
The top topics for pop songs at the time were love, no surprise there, sex, rock, social justice, and optimism.
Young folks, as everybody, express themselves in many ways, including the clothing and fashion that they wear. So let's take a look at a couple of the dominant culture messages that young people were getting in the 80s about clothing. Here's one clothing ad by a brand called Joanna.
With everything. He was holding this bunch of flowers, and then he said,
"I'm young, I'm not that bad looking. I just won the lottery, and I firmly believe that you can never have enough generic clothes. You coming with me?"
Well,
I'm going to hold my comments on that until we take a look at one more. This is a similar one by a clothing brand in the 80s called Ocean Pacific. So there's a couple things I noticed in both those commercials. One is the role of the man and the woman. The man comes and sweeps the woman away because they won the lottery or because they got a nice car, and they're going to take care of everything, and they're going to give the woman access to the dominant culture of the time, or the trappings of the dominant culture of the time. Punk rockers were largely rejecting these cultural norms that saw them as just consumers to buy fashionable clothing or products or whatever record was on the radio, and didn't really address topics and concerns that connected with their real lived experiences. So let's compare those cultural messages with what punk rock music was addressing, the topics that they were addressing. So let's go back to that research from 1986.
The top topics for punk songs were political and social corruption, alienation, and war.
These are the dominant topics that the punk rock music of that time was addressing. And you can see they're in stark contrast to what pop music on the radio was addressing. So punk rock communities offered a social space that these young people could relate to much more than they did to other social spaces. And it also offered music that addressed topics that related to their real lives that the pop music on the radio was not addressing. In the social sciences, we use these terms dominant ideology and dominant culture quite a bit. And all that means is, what is the pervasive or status quo culture, or what is the pervasive or status quo ideology? A lot of the dialogue and conversations from the dominant culture about punk rock frames punkers as these kids who just love to rebel, and that they're motivated by drug use and bad friendships, or their peer group. In other words, and you hear the teachers say this sometimes in high schools, that they just dismiss it as those are just the bad kids, and that's it. No thought other than that, those are just the bad kids. Well, I call bullshit on that one, and I think there's quite a bit of sociological research that backs me up. There's two studies in particular that I think about. One is about these two groups of kids from the same high school called the Saints and the Roughnecks. And so this guy who was working in the schools saw that there was two groups of kids, one from a more affluent family, kids from more affluent families, and others that were from lower socioeconomic status, and who was getting in trouble for certain behaviors. And he followed them and he researched them over a couple years. I'm not going to get too detailed in going into this, but at the end of the day, both of these two groups of boys were committing crimes, being violent, skipping school, doing drugs and alcohol. But the only group that really was attributed to these behaviors was the lower socioeconomic status, because they didn't have cars and didn't have private residence in order to hide these behaviors, so it was more publicly exposed. But both groups were doing it just the same. And I would argue the same thing about the punk rock community in the 80s, that the jocks and the preps, they were partying and doing bad behavior just as much as the punk rockers. They just weren't publicly noticeable. So here in a lot of the commentary about punk rockers at the time, that these kids are self-destructive and they just slam dance, and about this violence that was inherent to the system. And again, I would say, look at your football culture. You get in football, it's almost like a badge of honor to get injured. So these people that are criticizing the punk rock movement, in my opinion, need to look themselves in the mirror. Another criticism laid on the punk rock community of the 80s by dominant culture folks was this charge that punkers were just nasty and disrespectful and mean and impolite and all that stuff. And it's kind of interesting, just as a side note, there's a book called Popular that I think is interesting if you're interested in that subject. The Power of Likability in a Status-Obsessed World.
Punk rockers in general were not that concerned with their status within the dominant culture.
I'm going to close this video with the song from a band I was previously in the 90s, because there was a tune on there that I think directly relates to this topic. The band is Millennium Falcon, and the song is I Forgot. So thank you for listening, and peace out, people.
What to say, would you throw it away? Cause I got nothing to break anyway. Live so damn amused while the school